Thanks so much for joining. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Evan Sinar, the Chief Scientist and the Director for the Center of Analytics and Behavioral Research from Development Dimensions International, or DDI. Welcome, Evan. Glad to have you with us.
Yes, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And my name is Lynne Putz. I'm the Director of Solutions for TMC, a Berlitz company. Welcome. So before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items so you understand how we operate today. In order to reduce background noise, we'll keep all participants on mute throughout the webinar. That doesn't mean we don't want you engaged, of course. We would like to hear from you, so please type questions in the question box at any time during the presentation. I see we already have some in the question box. We'll reserve approximately 30 minutes at the end for a moderated question and answer session. Today's session will be recorded, and after the webinar, we'll share the link with you. So let's first find out who's on the line with us today. That's a quick poll. Wondering what your job role is in your organization. Are you in talent management, organizational development, training? Perhaps you're a business line leader, or other. And if other, please use the question box to identify your role with your organization. So we'd like to understand who's on the line with us today. Let's close and see who's with us. Excellent. Looks like we have the majority of people in the training role within their organization. Next is business line leaders. So thank you so much for that. We have quite a few talent managers, talent management professionals, and OD professionals as well. So other, we'll take a look at the question box and find out who else is with us. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Evan. Evan, take us away.
Yes, thanks so much, Lynn, and good to talk to everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Appreciate the opportunity to share the outputs and outcomes of this research that we've been working on over the past 18 months or so. This is a major research study for DDI in partnership with TMC, a Berlitz company, and other organizations. So this is, we were able to take a closer look at some topics that we feel will be of interest to you, and talking about those a bit more today. So we started this research by looking at where leadership was and where it was headed, really trying to understand the context and current state of readiness of leadership globally. So in our research, we also were able to partner with the Conference Board, and they recently conducted a study of CEO challenges. You might be familiar with this research, where they essentially ask CEOs and other organizational leaders what really keeps them up at night, what are they most concerned about and challenged by within their organization. And the top 4 challenges they came up with were, first of all, human capital, customer relationships, and then innovation and operational excellence. These are the 4 challenges that were top of mind for CEOs when they think about how they're going to lead their organization and their business into the future. And really all 4 of these have a close human capital component. Obviously one is directly related to human capital, but of course customer relationships, innovation, operational excellence, those will all be impossible without high-quality leaders and employees in place to drive those outcomes. So we started with that as a context for what leaders needed to be prepared for, what their C-level counterparts needed them to be ready for to advance their business further. And so we started with those frameworks and then applied those to views of actual leaders within organizations in our samples. We looked across 13,000 leaders in approximately 1,500 organizations to gauge where leaders actually were against these and other key talent practices. So what we found is that only about 1 in 3 leaders were deemed very prepared to meet these challenges in terms of their own readiness and how ready they felt to meet these challenges. Customer relationships a bit higher, almost half of leaders, but still quite low. Human capital, innovation, operational excellence, all for which leaders really felt unprepared to meet these challenges. Very few leaders felt that they're really ready to address these challenges on behalf of their business. So that gave us a context for the challenges that leaders were facing and their readiness or lack of readiness to meet those. We also looked at the quality of leadership and how this has changed over the past 3 years. Of course, there's been a lot of turmoil and economic uncertainty and other factors in the world, so we wanted to track how well leader quality was moving alongside those factors. And we saw that it really wasn't changing much. It hadn't changed much in about 3 years. So from a leader perspective, when we asked leaders to evaluate the quality within their own organizations, only a slight uptick from 38% to 40% of leaders viewing their organization's leaders as a whole as being high quality. HR's perspective was actually even more negative. Only about 25% of HR respondents felt that their leaders were highly capable within their organization. This is despite about $50 billion collectively being devoted towards leadership development efforts, which really is showing that those efforts aren't paying off, or at least not paying off to the degree that leader expectations are increasing. So leaders not only need to perform better, but they also need to grow along with their business. And we're seeing signs that that's just not occurring. We next want to ask the poll to understand a bit more about your view of your own leadership, and in particular, a future-facing view of your leadership. So our question is, what is the percentage of your critical roles within your company that could be immediately filled by internal candidates? So what percentage of your internal roles do you have someone waiting in the wings, ready to step into those roles when they need to? Another couple seconds here. Okay, so we're seeing signs of some severe bench strength gaps where you're looking into current leadership roles. When those leadership roles are unfilled, how readily can you fill those with your internal candidates? Most of you are saying less than 30% of your critical roles could be filled immediately. About a third are saying 30 or 45%, and only about 25% any higher than 45%. That's actually slightly lower than the global sample was, so we're seeing some challenges there across the globe. We're only about 46% on average of critical positions could be immediately filled by internal candidates. So not even a coin flip to be able to put someone in place who could step into that role immediately internally. We're also finding that the consequence of this is that if you're putting someone in the role that's coming either externally, there's going to be additional cost and expense and time put into that role to ramp them up into their level of capability. Or you can put someone in the role internally who's not ready, and that's going to be associated with some consequences as well. So another view of Ready Now Leaders for the Future is what percentage of your organization's leaders, what percentage of organizations view their future leaders? So when they look off into the next 3 years, what percentage of organizations view that group of leaders as being highly capable? We found that this was actually even lower. Only about 15% of organizations viewed their leaders that were going to guide them into the future over the next 3 years as being highly capable. So that gives us a sense of the context of the research and a context of the state of leadership that we're up against, where current leadership quality quite low, but actually future bench strength even a bit lower. So let's take a step back and give an overview of the overall research. So I mentioned that we brought in around 13,000 leaders. We were able to survey about 1,500 HR professionals, between them representing over 2,000 organizations. It was a global sample, 48 countries, particularly heavily represented in some of the high growth areas of the world, Southeast Asia, also Brazil, US, and Europe as well. This was a diverse sample, and this graphic just shows the different categories of leaders that were part of the sample. So some diversity in terms of gender, leader level across everything from front-level leaders, frontline leaders, all the way up to senior level leaders, regional, generation. We have a high portion of Generation X in the workforce, but also Generation Y and then baby boomers as well. Diverse in terms of industry, high potential status. We had a large number of high potential employees, or employees who have been designated as high potentials, and also company size, so ranging everything from smaller companies, less than 500 employees or so, up to very large multinational corporations. We did this research in partnership with TMC, a Berlitz company, and several other organizations that are listed here. When we looked in this research, we focused on 4 outcomes that we we're connecting different talent practices and leadership experiences to across the research. So we looked at this across the different outcomes, and you'll see these referred to a few times throughout today's presentation. First, we looked at the effectiveness of leadership development programs. So looking at, through the eyes of the leaders themselves, how positively do they view their organization's leadership development programs? Leader engagement and retention. So what's the leader's experience like within this company, and how is this resulting in them being more engaged as a leader and then likely to stay long-term with these organizations? Leadership quality, so taking into account both current quality and future bench strength. What do these outcomes look like for these organizations? And we also pulled in information about financial impact from external financial databases. So for the portion of organizations that were large enough and were publicly traded across the globe, we pulled in information about a composite on financial metrics related to profitability, earnings per share, rate of return to investors, stockholder equity. So we use this as a way to index the financial consequences of certain talent practices. And in a few cases, we were able to draw some pretty clear distinctions between talent practices and the financial health of the organization. So we're going to be focusing on 5 topics today. We're talking a bit about VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and what pressures that is creating for leaders. What is the state of leader readiness, in particular looking at different countries and different industries? What are some critical leadership skills that are contributing to leader readiness, and where do organizations stand on those? How are organizations deploying their leadership development and other leadership talent programs globally? And then finally, the power of cultural skill and how that relates to organizational success, and also a special focus on expatriate success. So what are organizations doing that's leading to higher rates of expatriate success in those assignments? So we looked at the concept of VUCA, which, if you haven't heard of it, it relates to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. These are essentially key forces that have been in place for many years, but have really heightened over the past several years with certain trends towards economic depression, currency volatility, energy prices, cybersecurity. These are all pressures that organizations are facing. As a result, their leaders are facing. We want to take into account what these pressures were and how leaders were actually responding to them, and how does this relate to how successful they are in leading their business forward. So we thought of this as a concept of a VUCA vortex. So what are these forces, and what's the experience of leaders being caught within these forces? And we asked HR respondents to indicate what percentage of your leaders do you consider incapable in meeting these VUCA challenges, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So only about 1 in 3 leaders, are viewed as wholly incapable of meeting these challenges. So slightly less so for volatility, ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity, somewhere in between. So these are the pressures that leaders are facing in the current environment. You know, Lynne, if you have some thoughts on this as well in terms of how this relates to some of the global pressures that organizations are facing.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. We definitely see this happening within our client organizations that we're interacting with as well. And of particular interest for us from a cultural perspective as it relates to VUCA is the interesting social neuroscience insights that are coming from that field that help us understand that as things get more complicated, as the business environment heats up with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, your cognitive ability degenerates and really reverts back to its natural state or its comfort state. And so if you're working in an environment that is unfamiliar to you, and it takes a lot of effort to adapt and to be agile in terms of the way that you interact with others, the way that you think, or the way that you're motivated, in a complex environment like a VUCA environment, we know that the tendency will be for you to retract, and for professionals when they're faced with distress or high tension or high stressful environments, their ability and their agility is lessened, and their bandwidth for ability to move along different dimensions of interacting with others and different ways of thinking about the environment definitely shrinks. And so that's of particular interest for us and for the work that we do with our clients, as I know DDI does as well, is to help those professionals try and work through that VUCA environment with a mindfulness and with a way and an approach that allows them to make the most of those opportunities instead of seeing those as almost moments of retraction and almost redaction of their ambition and the business goals that they have. So I don't know, Evan, if you've seen that same thing, but we're experiencing that quite a bit with our leaders and helping them bring a mindfulness to the VUCA environment so that they're better able to adjust and work through those situations as they come up.
Absolutely, and I think that those are the pressures we're seeing as well. And when we put leaders through assessment centers to really gauge their ability to respond and under very stressful situations designed to represent the day in the life of senior level leadership roles, even these senior leaders are struggling, particularly with volatility. So we see some parallels to the data we had from this global leadership forecast, where across these factors, leaders just aren't ready to the degree their organizations need them to be. And I think your points are very good ones about the degree of personal stress and tension this is causing for them. And of course, these trends are only increasing. So really, you can't be readying leaders quickly enough to meet these challenges because they're continuing to increase over time.
And Evan, just a quick clarification point on the percentages that are presented on the slide. One of our participants asked to clarify, is that the percentage of leaders who are not ready for VUCA? Can you elaborate on that just a little?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the percentage of HR respondents that indicated that their organization's leaders are not ready. So this is at an organization level. 40% of HR respondents were saying that their leaders were not ready for volatility, as an example. So when you asked HR respondents to gauge and evaluate the organization's leaders as a whole, these are those percentages. These are percentages that are incapable. And actually, if you flip it around to the very capable, you've got a fair percentage that are in the middle, but only about 18% on average of leaders are considered very capable. So you've got a large group at the lower end of that distribution, but not many at the higher end. So less than 1 in 5 leaders are considered very capable on these same dimensions. All right, we're going to turn to some views of leader readiness. So as we diagnose and look at leadership readiness across the globe, we looked at 2 particular lenses on this. One in terms of countries. So how do countries vary on their average levels of leader readiness, and how do industries vary as well? This allowed us to look a little bit more closely at some of the global trends and also industry trends that might be affecting the degree of current leader readiness. So for every country and industry that we had enough data on to look at leaders as a set within that group, so several hundred leaders within an industry, several hundred leaders within a country, also across a few dozen organizations. So when we had a critical mass of those leaders, we were able to take a closer look at leadership readiness within each of those domains. So starting off by looking at leader quality and bench strength ratings by country. So for this, we looked at current leader quality. So this is the organization's view, the HR's view of average leader quality within these countries. So average respondents rating their organization's leaders. That's current quality. And then also future bench strength. So that's the metric that refers to leaders who are going to take you into the next 3 years. So when you look 3 years out, what do you see your future bench strength as? And so we ordered these countries in terms of where they fell on this ranking. What's also important to note is that it's often difficult to compare countries directly, so we took that into account to make sure that we were factoring out some cultural differences in how individuals respond to certain response scales and those factors to allow for a more direct comparison. So this is where these countries came out in terms of a few different categories. So we had India and South Africa, whose current leader quality and bench strength was at the highest end of this range. Then you've got the next category down with Mexico, Philippines, United States. High current leader quality, but some signs of deficiency in future bench strength, where that was moderate. Indonesia actually had the opposite pattern, where current leader quality was a bit lower, but leaders waiting in the wings for the future were a bit stronger. Australia, Taiwan, and Thailand all had moderate quality and future bench strength. Canada and Chile, similar, but starting to trend into the lower end. And then some of the countries on the bottom, which initially surprised us a bit, and Lynne, you'll talk about this a bit as well, but one important piece of context here is this is not referring to the best leaders, it's referring to the average state of leadership in these countries. So these countries, all these countries have leaders that are high quality, many leaders that are high quality, but these are leaders across the country. So when you look at how well these certain proportion of high quality leaders are spreading out across these countries, this is where some of these countries fell a bit lower. So Brazil and China, some of the highest growth economies, actually fell a little bit lower on this metric when you look at their average state of leadership across those regions.
Yeah, and just a word about that, Evren. It's interesting that India rates so high. That is one of the geographies that our clients are continually working and striving to develop and to work with more effectively. And China and Japan being both low on current leader quality and future bench strength. Interestingly enough, the government is spending a considerable amount of money in both of those countries to develop, both at the university level and at the professional level, to develop their future bench strength and to develop their current leader quality to an extreme. So we see some real focused effort to bring that level up, both in Japan and China, and I'm sure in the other countries as well, but that's specifically what we are seeing directly in our work with our clients. And you know, South Africa and India being very robust in both elements is quite surprising from this research. So really, really great insights here, Evan.
Yes, thanks. And I think I think your comments are well taken in terms of how organizations or how these countries are deploying a focused effort to improve in these areas. And I think the ones that really stood out for me were Brazil and China, which are recognized as, of course, being some of the highest growth economies over the past several years. And I think what we might be seeing is a bit of a leadership not being a cause of growth, or perhaps being a cause of growth, but now actually being a consequence of growth, where there are gaps in leadership. So there's simply not enough high-quality leaders to meet the needs of growth in these countries. And so they have shown growth over the past 3 years. We also looked at some data comparing from 3 years ago, and Brazil and China had shown growth there, but I think this raises the question of whether their leadership growth is proceeding at the same degree that their country's growth and expansion has happened. We'll turn attention to some similar data on industry. In this case, we looked at this a bit differently, where we looked at the change of leadership quality over the past 3 years. So to what degree was that decreasing or not changing versus increasing? So that's along the bottom, the x-axis there. And then going up on the graph is the change in bench strength. So when we look at leaders over the next 3 years, we asked them to rate the quality of their incoming leaders and their leaders stepping in 3 years ago, and we did it again in 2014. So we use this as a way to array these these industries on both of these dimensions, and we defined these 4 categories based on where these different industries fell in this matrix. So first of all, in the upper left, you've got what we were calling industries that have leaders that were eager and waiting impatiently. So there's some challenges with current leader quality, but you've actually got some fairly promising incoming leaders that are ready to step in that, again, we put ourselves in their shoes a bit and thought they might be actually quite impatient and ready to step in for leaders that they see, and this data seems to indicate it's true, that are lower in current leader quality. So the retail and energy sectors fell into that category. On the upper right are industries that actually were very promising on both of those dimensions, so higher leader quality, an increase in leader quality, as well as increase in bench strength. So they've seen some positive changes for both of those. And those industries, it's a matter of staying the course and proceeding with the plans they're currently working on. Many challenges and few leaders in the bottom right. So that's where current leader quality is quite strong, but these may be industries that are actually outstripping their bench strength, so outstripping the leaders that are ready to step in when the current leaders retire or move on, and then headed in the wrong direction. So these are industries that we found were actually negative on both of these dimensions. So leader quality was decreasing, and then bench strength was decreasing as well. Another perspective on this is we also found that those on the right side of this matrix tended to be industries that had a higher profit margin. So they might have more of investment that they can put into leader, particularly leader quality, current leader development. So that does seem like it might be paying off in terms of quality of their current rank of leaders. All right, we'll turn to a key distinction and key challenge that many organizations are facing when they look to roll their programs out globally is how do they do that? How do they manage consistency? How do they strike a balance between local influence and corporate influence? We're able to look at a few different methods and approaches that organizations use when deploying various leadership programs internationally, particularly multinational organizations. And what were their challenges that they faced in doing so? So we found that across multinationals, about 52%, over half had global expansion plans, 46% shown aggressive growth over the past 3 years. However, when it came to consistency, only about 15% of organizations considered their leadership programs consistent as they've been deployed across the globe. And it really raised the question of what does consistency mean? And can you actually have too much consistency, or how do organizations find the right balance in consistency? Because full consistency means that you're really deploying the exact same programs across the globe, and that's not likely to be most effective either. So we were able to put that to the test by looking more specifically at several programs and how well those were structured and balanced across these 3 different categories. So first of all, corporate controlled. So these are programs that have a full or nearly full influence from the corporate perspective, the center of the operation. More of a balanced perspective, we've got approximately equal influence between corporate forces and local forces. And then locally controlled, where these were fully or nearly fully controlled by the local operations with little influence from the corporate center. And we do have a poll question here associated with this question, and that is, which of the following talent programs are you finding the most challenging as you look to deploy them across the globe? So where are you seeing the most challenges as you look to deploy these programs? Which ones are harder to do so than others? All right, so we've got the majority for frontline leadership development, so development for those first-level leaders, the most challenging aspect of global program deployment. Senior-level leadership development tied for second, leadership selection promotion, then succession management, so a fair amount of balance here. No one said performance management, which was interesting, but more of a focus on some of the core leadership development aspects all the way from the front line to senior level, and then leadership selection promotion slightly behind. And what we looked at in our research was, first of all, how are these programs being balanced with their influence? So those 3 categories, corporate influence, more of a balanced connection between local and corporate, and then fully locally influenced. We also were able to index how effective those programs were. So this was based on the HR respondents. So they were providing information about both effectiveness and the distribution of corporate versus local control. And we found that there were 3 programs that were most effective when they were corporate controlled. These really relate to who gets in, who moves up, who shares the strategic vision within the organization. These programs became less effective the more they drifted away from having a corporate-focused mindset. So when you're deciding who comes into the organization, how they move through the organization, those tended to become less effective the more they moved away from corporate focus. Similarly with senior level leaders who are really shepherding and setting the tone for the overall organization, we found that they needed a close grounding in corporate perspective as they look to play that role. However, for 3 programs, we did find a balance, and here's where you see some of the programs that we were talking about earlier, particularly frontline leadership development, where for frontline and actually mid-level leadership development as well, this is where a close perspective and close attention to the local environment in terms of learning styles, logistical parameters, those need to play a stronger influence to be able to build effectiveness into these programs. Succession management was a bit surprising to us at first because this is often thought of as a higher level leadership progression, but many organizations have actually extended that extended that pipeline down further into leadership. So when you look across the different levels of leadership, that starts to bring in the local context a bit more. What's also interesting here is thinking about this in the context of expatriates and the role that they're playing as they look to move into these countries and put in place management that can sustain after they go back to their home countries. From a succession management perspective, expatriates are really managing that balance most directly. If they come into the organization, if they come into the local operation and are seen as just influencing from a corporate perspective, but that influence becomes full control, that can actually lead to lower levels of effectiveness. But if they're striking this balance, particularly for these frontline, mid-level, and succession management factors, that's leading to the highest level of effectiveness. We also looked at which programs are most effective when heavily locally controlled. We actually didn't find any in this case. It doesn't mean that local influence is not important, but this is really a case of where corporate connection really becomes full abdication and really a full lack of any connection to how these local operations are deploying their talent programs. And so when that was the case, these programs actually became less effective. So we didn't find any of these 6 programs that we looked at being most effective when they were locally controlled, almost exclusively. And then I'm wondering if you, based on your experience, thoughts you may have on this finding as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Evan. And I want to reflect back on the stat that you presented when you started this one-section global program implementation. The 52% of the respondents have global expansion plans. We're seeing that as very important in our work with clients, as I know DDI is as well. And that is in the merger and acquisition and joint venture space. There's a stunning figure in 2014 of $3.6 trillion done in deals, and more $10 million deals than has been seen since 2007. So those cross-border deals comprise about 1/6 of the activity. And again, that's not been seen since the mid-90s. Right now, we're at 43% of all activity being cross-border deals. That's a significant weight. This is a VUCA environment, if we can ever see a VUCA environment, right? Because merger and acquisitions currently are experiencing a 15% failure rate. And again, that failure rate hasn't been seen since 1999. So we're seeing some very volatile environments with both merger and acquisitions, joint ventures, and also spin-offs and kind of the decommissioning of joint ventures and merger and acquisitions as well. In fact, one of our clients is splitting currently and is struggling with that cultural shift, going from a merged environment to a fractured environment where they had a holistic product line, and now they are spinning off specific elements of that product line. And what does that mean on the, in terms of business decisions, in terms of being able to clearly see the future and a way forward that makes sense? The dynamic environment is certainly something that our leaders are staying up at night being very concerned about. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that M&A and JV environment is really playing a role in the global expansion plans, whether that's for cost containment or whether that's for revenue generation.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really great point. The role that mergers and acquisitions and those forces are playing. So that's really being layered on top of the global deployment, is the fact that you're working with not only new operations, new companies, but new countries, and factoring that into the complexity leads to some pretty daunting scenarios for these leaders. So thank you for that.
Sure. Yep.
We want to talk a little bit about, from a skill perspective, where are organizations focusing their efforts to develop leader skills, and what are the skills that they view as most critical for the next 3 years? So this is a great chance for us to really identify some hypocrisy for organizations where they were telling us one thing where they should be focusing, but yet their actual programs were focused very differently. So we asked them two sets of questions. One, we asked how critical do they view these skills for the next 3 years? So within the next 3 years, how important is this going to be as a key attribute for your leaders? And then where are they currently focusing? So where are they currently putting their efforts from a leadership development perspective to actually grow these leaders and build their readiness in these skills? And if all was in line, if organizations were planning perfectly for the future, these would, you'd have nothing in the upper left or lower right boxes, but unfortunately we do, and that indicates some gaps. It indicates some gaps between either a heavier current focus or perhaps a lack of recognition of the future criticality of some of these core interaction skills, so building consensus and commitment, communicating and interacting with others in particular. There's a high degree of focus there, but less perceived criticality. We would argue that part of that's due to a lack of awareness that these skills really are foundational to many other roles that leaders play. So if they're not communicating well, if they're not building consensus, it's going to be very hard for them to become proficient in more advanced leader skills like delegation, complex decision making, other aspects of the role that they're looking to build out. If you look at the bottom right side of this matrix, these are skills that were identified as highly important for the future, but lower in current focus. So here's where you start to see some influence of some of the cultural skill factors with leading across countries and cultures. It's a known need, but organizations aren't taking many steps to address that need. Fostering employee creativity and innovation is similar, where they're not taking steps to actually build leader skills in these areas currently, even though they're recognizing its value for the future. And then I think, I know, Lynne, you have some great perspective on this as well in terms of how this might speak to how organizations are factoring in cultural skills in the context of this broader portfolio of leadership characteristics that they're looking to develop.
Yeah, and a great example just came across in the Wall Street Journal the other day. They were covering some developments in Saudi Arabia, and they coined a term that I hadn't heard before, and that's Saudiization. And that's the nationalization of the workforce, by the way. Right now, there's about 56% of the employees in Saudi that are expatriates. That means 44% of the workforce is comprised of nationals. Now, compare that to Qatar, where 94% of the employee base is comprised of expats. So the ability for leading across countries and cultures is quite interestingly put to the test. In the UAE and in the Middle East in particular, just from this example, when those socioeconomic situations are developing and are new, and this is just happening over the last 5 years. So how do you navigate that? How do you effectively address those situations and still maximize the business that you have going in that region of the world while navigating those particular complexities? So we're definitely seeing that leading across countries and cultures as an extremely important component, and I think our next slide gets us a little bit more deeply into this, right, Evan?
It does, absolutely, yeah. That's a nice transition to this next slide, where we took a closer look at two different categories of skills. We did look at several non-intercultural skills. Some of the ones we mentioned earlier, communication, interacting, building consensus and commitment, or I should say those certainly have a cultural component, but they were distinct from a specific cultural focus. And we asked leaders to evaluate themselves on these two sets of skills. We asked them to evaluate them on each of the skills we saw on the prior page. And we saw a pretty clear distinction between their perceived effectiveness and confidence in the non-cultural skills versus the intercultural skills. And it's also important to recognize that these were leaders limited to only those within multinational corporations. So organizations that are going through the trends that Lynne described to acquire and move into other countries, even for those individuals in those organizations, there's a steep drop-off from their confidence and capability between the non-cultural skills, which average about 63% of leaders consider themselves highly effective, down to the point where less than half in every case of leaders consider themselves highly effective for these three cultural skills: integrating in the intercultural environments, intercultural communication, and leading across countries and cultures, which was the lowest. So it's really brought into stark contrast their confidence level in learning these skills and applying these skills as they look to play their roles as global leaders.
And Evan, just want to point out something very interesting here in this space, the intercultural skills. The Corporate Leadership Council put out an interesting study that identified the fact that cultural skills are certainly a enabler, and the lack of cultural skills are a derailer for affecting global expansion plans and cost containment, whatever the emphasis might be for our clients. But one of the interesting points that the Corporate Leadership Council found in their research was that it was not critical for leaders to develop the absolute perfect intercultural skills. It was important that they develop base cultural skills, intercultural skills. So the ability to navigate into intercultural and foreign environments, to communicate effectively, and to lead across countries and cultures was enabled by a language and perhaps a DNA of a multinational corporation that allowed for a specific dynamic that was inclusive in its vocabulary, that was non-judgmental about differences, that was enabled to affect that global business focus that they might have. But it was not absolutely critical for them to spend a considerable amount of time developing it in a formal environment, meaning that if you look at the 70-20-10 split around learning, that 10% was not as important as the cultural skills being part of that 70%, where the environment was enabling them to be culturally competent and bring that to the work environment and then in their leadership as well. So, the good news is that it's not that difficult. It's just an effort and an organizational imperative to make sure that the underpinning is there, and then they can realize the benefits of that at the organizational level, down to the individual level as well.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. We also want to turn attention next to the challenges that organizations face in deploying their leaders globally, so putting them onto expatriate assignments. I also want to just briefly clarify terminology on the past slide. So MNC, that's referred to multinational corporations, and so for these analyses, we focused only for the organization's leaders that were working within companies that had multinational operations. Some were operating just within a single country, but the MNC view we felt was most appropriate for these questions. So as organizations look to place their bets, and as they're expanding globally, they need to get new employees on the ground in these local operations to help drive that global expansion. So we're going to look at that success rate of individuals in those roles. So we asked HR respondents to indicate what is their organization's success rate for expatriate assignments. So they could say anything from 0% to 100%. 58% was their response on average. So that was helpful to know about. And that's consistent with some of the broader research that you've got about 42%. So not much more than half of these assignments are succeeding in the context of what they're expecting from them, and these are costly failures, of course, also. But we want to look more closely at what the organizations that were doing this well were really doing differently, and what were the specific talent practices that were actually impacting and most closely linked to success rates for these expatriate assignments. And so these are the 5 factors that we identified as having the closest link and the most rational link to expatriate success rates for these organizations. So we'll step through these in this section. So first of all, we looked at leading across countries and cultures, integrating oneself in a cultural environment, and then intercultural communication within international business environments. So 2 of these 3, actually on their own, they seem to have an effect. Of course, you're not proving full causality here, but you're looking at what organizations doing this well are doing differently. So when organizations had programs in place, when they're putting a heavy focus on leading across countries and cultures and integrating oneself in an intercultural or foreign environment, for each of those, just taking that one factor into account, the average success rate was going up about 5% to about 63%. So for leading across countries and cultures and integrating oneself, the success rate went up slightly, but importantly for those factors. Intercultural communication was a bit interesting, and Lynne, I know you have some great thoughts on this too. That was one that actually on its own, it wasn't leading to higher levels of expatriate success, but when paired with some of these other factors, it was contributing to higher success overall. But when organizations, one way of looking at it is when organizations only did that, when they only focused on intercultural communication without taking into account other cultural factors, that alone was not driving higher levels of expatriate success. So Lynne, I'm curious on your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a behavior, right? And that's a skill set, but there's got to be a mindfulness that's brought to that as well in the beginning and as a root and as a baseline. So, you know, the concepts that we have and we regularly employ start with mindfulness and self-awareness. And our cultural assessment, the COI, enables that. And I know DDI has lots of assessments as well that enable this introspection that is necessary to approach situations with an open-mindedness, to approach new situations with an agile framework that is able to navigate those situations in a very productive way. So that communication is a skill set that stems from it, but certainly isn't the baseline. The baseline starts from, you know, self-awareness and understanding, you know, our own cultural underpinnings and how those cultural underpinnings then relate and develop our skill sets and our behaviors out of that. So great point, and certainly we agree and are happy to see this kind of research identifying these areas of focus because that's truly something we see in our client base as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. It really reinforces the importance of thinking in an integrated way about how these skill development programs can work together. Because if you just take one in isolation without taking into account the broader context and how these relate to one another into more of a learning program rather than just a single learning event, you can see the disadvantages of that event-based approach. So I really like the way you described that. Two additional factors here. First of all, using developmental assignments that had a cross-cultural focus to them. And the key here is developmental, of course, because even expatriate assignments, if not structured and paired with an appropriate frame of development, and what are individuals expected to be learning, and how will they make sure that they're actually growing as a learner and as a leader on these assignments? So taking a very developmental approach to these assignments. So this question was essentially asking organizations to indicate how often are their developmental assignments characterized as cross-cultural. And when their assignments were more likely to be cross-cultural in nature, they had a slightly higher average expatriate success rate. And then the process for identifying global leaders. So as organizations decide who becomes eligible and who takes these roles, having a formal process in place rather than something that's subjective-based or convenient-based in terms of someone who's just available to move versus someone who's the right person to move into these roles. That also had an impact.
Yeah, and Evan, before you go on, I just wanted to point out one example, and I want to make sure we have enough time for question and answer too, so I'll just mention this. We have a fantastic program that we work with one of our clients on. It's called the General Management Acceleration Program. And in that program, they specifically address each one of these components. So I'm really thrilled and am excited to give that feedback to our client as well, that they're on the right track. They're addressing the very specific components that are important to developing their expatriates and their future global leaders. Because they have their general management trainees and candidates in a 2-year cycle that loosely follows the 70-20-10 method of learning, where 10% is a formal approach, but 20% is very tied to their cohorts and learning from others, with 70% is really on-the-job training in that 2-year cycle, 1 year in their home country and another year in a key geography to the company's key to the company's success. So interesting that our client is specifically following this almost to a T, and it's working very, very well. They have a strong pipeline of future leaders in the organization, so they aren't kept up at night with that same worry that a lot of our other clients are. So I think that's very interesting and great to see it applied too.
That's a great point, and a really nice transition, because it sounds like some of the organizations you're working with are in this category where they're actually doing all of these things. So no one of these is going to solve the problem and dramatically soar expatriate rates, success rates on its own. But when you pair them together, as again some of the examples you gave, where you're tying these together into a broader leadership program and a coordinated approach to develop and prepare and sustain expatriate leaders. Here are some of the trends we saw versus organizations that did none of these things and organizations that did all of these things. So organizations that did none of these things, they put no focus on any of these areas that you see on the left, nor did they see developmental assignments as cross-cultural in nature, no formal process in place. They've only had 44%. So for them, it was actually quite a bit lower than the average. So the majority of their expatriate assignments were failing, versus those that were doing all 5 of these. That went down to the percentage of failure went down to only 31%, so almost over 2/3 of these expatriate assignments were succeeding when they put these processes in place. So a 25% increase in expatriate success rates. But this was rare. This was rare to the point that organizations were 3.5 times more likely to do none of these things than do all 5 of these. So even for multinational corporations, they were not taking these steps that they need to, and really squandering the opportunity to pretty dramatically influence expatriate success rates. And that's the question we want to turn to next as a polling question is, what percentage of your leaders have either completed or are currently on an international assignment, so we could help map that to some of our data and some of the implications. So if you could take a second to tell us what percentage of your leaders are either currently on or have already completed an international assignment. That'll give us a sense of context for how many of your organizations are in these, how many of your leaders are in these roles. Okay, so we've got the majority that actually have expatriate assignments as fairly rare, less than 15%, about a quarter in the 15 to 25% range, and then 8% and 15% between 35 and 45%. In the context of this sample, and again, we looked just at multinational corporations for this part of the analyses, we found a slightly higher rate here with about 40% of their leaders being on expatriate assignments. And one of the points we wanted to make here, and it's an obvious one, but it's important to play these numbers out a bit, we feel, is these are costly assignments. The cost of failure for these assignments and the consequences are not only severe for the individual and their success in the organization, but the organization as a whole, when they look at having to replace those roles or send yet another leader on an expatriate assignment as a cost of failure. So even low-end estimates of expatriate assignments are often in the $500,000 range, and many estimates extend up into the $1 million and more, of course, depending on the level of the role. But even for a basic leadership assignment, it's easily in the range of $500,000 when all associated costs are taken into account. So when we looked in our organization, we had about 40% of the leaders had completed an expatriate assignment. If you scale that across about 3,000 leaders, and you translate that to a pure financial impact, you've actually got about a $6 million per percentage point benefit in improving expatriate success. And we saw that earlier ratio of 44% to 69%. That scales pretty quickly in its financial impact. So we wanted to make that connection pretty clear between the success rates and the financial outcomes associated.
Fantastic.
We also looked more directly at the financial impact. So how much more likely were organizations to be in the top 20% of financial performers versus the bottom 20% when they had a heavy focus on these programs and when their leaders were more confident in these cultural skills? So this went all the way up from 2.5 to 2.7 to 4.5 times more likely. This is how much more likely these organizations were to be financially successful when their leaders had these skills in place versus organizations whose leaders did not have these skills, were not capable of these skills. So there's a direct financial impact there as well. We'll move through this pretty quickly because this basically shows how these different pieces tie together. I know we want to get to a few minutes for questions. So when you look at current financial linkages between effective development and leadership quality, and then in turn to financial impact, based on current data, when this data were gathered, we saw a strong link between effective development and leadership quality. So the way this is interpreted as when companies had high-quality leadership development programs in the eyes of their leaders, they were 11 times more likely to have high leadership quality compared to organizations with poor quality development programs. Similar effect on leader experience, so basically shows the effect of high-quality leadership development on leader engagement and retention, and then financial impact. So when high-quality leaders were in place, they tended to be much more likely to be financially successful. It was also interesting to see that even though leader experience didn't have a direct effect on financial impact, when you paired it with leadership quality, this ratio actually went up even further. So now organizations that paired high leader quality with highly engaged leaders were 5 times more likely to be financially successful than organizations that were low in quality and with low leader engagement. So that's current state, but we also wanted to look at, over time, what were organizations doing 3 years ago and how did that relate to financial impact in the current state. So we looked back at companies who had participated in the prior version of our leadership forecast in 2011. We saw some stronger effects there. So a high effect on leader experience, so high quality leadership development, much more likely to have highly engaged and retained leaders, high leadership qualities. This is all based on data 3 years ago. But then what was their financial outcome 3 years later? This went up actually even further. So high quality leaders, when those were in place, those organizations were 6 times more likely to be financially successful than those who weren't. When you pair with leader experience, 9 times more successful. So in the context of the pretty volatile environment across these past 3 years with some of the VUCA considerations, we feel this really shows the sustained and long-term impact of high-quality development programs as the genesis and as the basis for higher quality leaders, more engaged leaders, and ultimately more financial success. So just a couple quick points about some of the data, and a few questions have come through asking for some additional information and details about the research. We've got the full report available at this site, and we'll share a recording of these slides as well, so you can obtain additional information, which if we don't have a chance to cover your question today, will be available. And then Lynne, I'll turn it over to you. I know there's some other upcoming webinars that your group will be working on.
Sure, absolutely. Evan, thank you so much for your presentation and for contributing to the GLF presentation today. The insights are really quite valuable for us and in the work that we're doing. We have a continuation of the webinar series in April. We're focused on language learning and cultural competence combination, and Jeff Santilli is going to be presenting that, who is our Manager of Facilitation and Instruction for Berlitz North America. And then May 20th, we're going to focus on true cultural agility, moving beyond national cultural barriers. Very apropos considering the topic of today. So certainly welcome you to those next upcoming sessions. If you'd like more information, you can email us at info@tmcorp.com, where we regularly post our information, white papers, and you will find a recording of today's session at tmcorp.com, which is our corporate website. We are at the top of the hour. We do have some questions. We will close our recording at this point in time, and we will finish up with some questions here just to finish out the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining.